Good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing today? Amber, please drive carefully on the road. We do not want you getting in a wreck today while you're listening to psychology lecture. Good morning, April. Good to see you. How you doing? It's good to see both of you today. Hello, hello. Do we have any other visitors this morning? Anybody want to check in and say hello? So we got Amber and April, my two stalwart students that are always here with me. You ladies are awesome. Everybody doing well this morning? You know, it's exam week, so we've got our second exam this week from Friday to Sunday night. I'm going to be doing a review session Friday morning at 9 a.m., just like I did for the first exam here on YouTube. And of course, everybody is invited to come to my review session on Friday morning, just like you did last time. Good morning, Yanan. Good to see you. Good to see you. Thanks to those of you that are here today. Got my Weight Tech badge on. Maybe I should take that off. I don't quite need that till I go to work. Okay, so we are dealing with Chapter 8. You know, I don't know if you folks know this, but you are officially, after this Friday, you will be officially a little bit over halfway through this semester. I hope you're as excited about that as I am. These semesters always seem to drag on. I get in the middle of them and I'm super duper tired. I don't know about you. April, you ready for this semester to be over? Amber, you won't be interacting, and that's fine. But I'd ask you the same question. Yes. Okay, Amber was at least able to type in a yes and give me a hand clap. No kidding, right? Have we started sign-ups for next semester yet? I'm not sure if we're doing that yet. Maybe. I still have 60 questions and 2 short answers. Yes, it's still going to have 60 questions and about 2 short answers. You know, I may change it a little bit here or there, but they're going to be pretty much the same format each time. That's a really good question. That's a really good question. All right. So let's see. Oh, my goodness. Here we go. So today we're talking about Chapter 8, IQ testing right here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the invention of IQ tests, the properties of IQ tests. And then on Thursday, we're going to talk about evaluating IQ testing, coming up with newer theories of IQ testing. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started if we could. How many of you have ever, I won't say that. I would say how many of you have ever taken an IQ test? But the thing is, each and every one of you have taken an IQ test. If you have children right now, I'm almost positive your children were given an IQ test in the 3rd grade. IQ tests went from non-existent in 1900 to so much a part of the fabric that you folks have grown up in a standardized testing world. How many of you are sick of standardized tests? Your children taking standardized tests, anyone? Any of you ever taken an SAT or one of these type tests? All of these tests really, in a sense, all of these standardized tests, SAT, GREs, the ASVAB, every standardized test you've ever taken can thank its origin and development to the invention of IQ tests. Now, we're going to differentiate between an IQ test or an aptitude test and an achievement test. All right. What you're going to take in here this weekend from Friday to Sunday is what's known as an achievement test. And an achievement test simply evaluates how well you learned a set of information related to a topic of interest. So if any of you have to take a nursing exam, that's an achievement test. If any of you ever took a CPR class and had a little test at the end of your CPR class, that's an achievement test. Anybody has a math or an AP exam or a psych exam, these are all achievement tests. And I hope you understand that your grade in my test on this Friday is not an indicator of how smart you are. It's simply an indicator of whether or not you studied and learned the material I wanted you to know. We're going to differentiate that from what's known as an aptitude test. And IQ tests were designed to measure your aptitude. What is aptitude, Chris? Well, aptitude is your ability to learn, not just a set of facts, but how clever you are. How clever you are. Okay? Do any of you have a child that is in AG education and getting one of those special IEPs for being in gifted education? Do we have any people out there who have a child in gifted education? If you do, your child took an aptitude test and did well on an aptitude test. I got April giving me a high five. Good for you, April. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but IQ tests were actually invented in France about 117 years ago. Actually 115 years ago. A fellow named Alfred Binet was asked by the French government to develop a test to help identify children who would need extra help in schools. That's the only reason IQ tests were developed. They were developed to identify children who were slow learners that might need extra help in school. IQ tests were developed with the most noble of purposes, to help people out. Now, here's the deal. He came up with 20 quick test questions that allowed him to assess whether or not a child was as clever as the other children their age. And he came up with these 30 questions that went from super easy to super hard. Let me give you an example of one of his super easy test items. He would light a match, and then he would move it left and right. And the idea was, does the child have the sense to follow the lighted flame? And you know what? He found that even a 2-year-old could do that, right? He then came up with super duper hard questions. How about this? Does anybody know the answer to this question? My neighbor has had 3 visitors this week: a doctor, a lawyer, and a priest. What is happening at my neighbor's house? What is happening at my neighbor's house? Can anybody tell me what's happening at the neighbor's house? They've had a lawyer, a doctor, and a priest. What's happening at the lawyer's house? Who knows? Who's going to be my clever person? Who's going to answer it? Can anybody tell me what's going on at the neighbor's house? In the meantime, hi, Erica. Good to see you. Thanks you could make it today. Holy cow. My neighbor is dying, right? He has a doctor to help him. He has a lawyer to take care of his final responsibilities. And he's got a priest to pray over his soul. And he found that only the cleverest and oldest children could figure that out. Now, this test, what he did was, in this test, was he compared you to what he thought you should know based upon your age. How many of you have ever had your child know what we're talking about when we're talking about reading at grade level? Anybody ever had a kid or been told that you were reading above grade level or below grade level? Anybody ever had that experience before? Okay. The first IQ tests were basically designed this way. That is, these based on the number of questions you could answer, he could tell you how old your mind appeared to be or what your mental age was. So if you could only answer the easiest question, he might say your mental age was 2. If you could answer some of the easier questions, your mental age might be 3 or 4 or 5. And if you could answer all of the really, really hard questions, your mental age might be as old as 12, 13, 16 even. So he had a way where he thought he could compare your mental age and figure out what your mental age was. He would then divide that by your chronological age to tell us whether or not you were either above children your age or behind children your age. Does that make sense? So if you knew exactly if you were 6 years old, that was your chronological age, and you could answer the questions that a 6-year-old could, your mental age would be 6, your chronological age would be 6, and therefore your IQ ratio would be 1. Let me go. Technique, Alfred Binet was able to, in a sense, assess whether or not your child was slower than the other children around them. All right. Now, this test caught and I'm not calling it an IQ test. I've said that a couple of times, but that's wrong. It hasn't been named an IQ test. But a fellow named William Stern uh, uh, over in Stanford University caught wind of this test, and he thought this was a great idea. So what he did was he renormed the test for American children. What exactly does a norm mean? A norm means finding out what people at a certain ability level can do. So if I know which questions a 6-year-old can answer, which questions a 7-year-old can answer, which questions an 8-year-old can answer, I have normed my test. I have normed my test. Oh, I know what the problem is. Oh my goodness. Okay. I know what the problem is. Let's see. Whiteboard. Right. I forgot. When I go to my video screen, I've got to put the camera in there. I'll fix that after class. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. And so this was how the first IQ test was created. Now, William Stern thought this was an absolutely great idea too. And so he took the test and figured out what children could do. Hold on just a second. Video capture device. Boom. Front camera. Okay. Now, this guy named William Stern took this test and he brought it across the pond to California. Okay. And what he did was, can you all hear me now? You should be able to hear me now. Hopefully you can. Okay. And so William Stern took this same test. Ooh, 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 ooh. Uh, uh, William Stern took this same test. Oops. And he did one interesting thing to it. He took it and he multiplied it times 100. So this kid had an IQ of 100. This kid would have an IQ of 150. And this child would have an IQ of 67. So do you see that? He basically multiplied it times 100, and he identified and he created the first IQ test. Now, the IQ test he created was called the Stanford revision of the Binet IQ test. And the Stanford Binet IQ test is still in use today. It is the oldest IQ test in the world. Okay? Now, here's the neat thing. This test was unknown at the time, but the Army, the U.S. military, found out about this test and they thought that this would be a great idea for evaluating recruits. And so what they did is they adopted this IQ test and started giving it to recruits during World War I to figure out which recruits would be best to do the hard jobs and which recruits would be best to do the intellectually easy jobs. And this test was known as the Army Alpha test. The Army then revised it. It became known as the Army Beta test. And now, any of you who ever joined the military or thought about joining the military probably took the ASVAB. How many of you have taken the ASVAB test? Anybody taken the ASVAB before? I took it in high school. The ASVAB is nothing more than an IQ test that was developed for military purposes. Okay? Now, this test was so successful for the military that it became very popular in the United States, and suddenly the use of the IQ test was born. Now, back in 1910, if you wanted to go to a fancy college, you needed to go to a fancy private high school. But if you lived out in Iowa or out in Texas or in the middle part of the country, if you didn't live in Boston or New York, you couldn't go to a fancy private school. And the way you got into colleges in 1900 was by going to a fancy private school and having all kinds of stuff on your resume. And somebody said, hey, wait a minute. What if we use this IQ test to compare kids all across the nation? And if you think about it, this will allow us to see if that kid out in Michigan or that kid in Texas is as smart as that kid in Boston who's going to the fancy private school. And so IQ tests became a way of fairly comparing students from different backgrounds and different situations, right? And so this allowed schools to open themselves up to students who maybe didn't have the money or the ability to go to a fancy private school. And suddenly IQ tests became incredibly important. Okay? Now, and the neat thing is you're going to find IQ tests everywhere today. You know what? Your school psychologist is going to use them. If in third grade, all children take a pencil and paper IQ test called the Woodcock-Johnson. It's the most popular paper and pencil test. And this is the one that decides whether or not your child is going to get into gifted education. All right? And your school psychologist is going to give these group tests. Now, if your child maybe is struggling in school and we're trying to figure out if your child has a learning disorder, your school psychologist will actually give you an IQ test. Now, in clinical settings, IQ tests are given individually. They're one-on-one. Now, this is not something you could do with 10 million school children every year. So the pencil and paper test is used for what we would call children who are not having problems, maybe normal children, to see who the clever ones are that we can put into gifted education. The individual tests are given to children who we think may have a reading disorder, a math disorder, or ADHD, or some other disorder which is preventing them from doing well in school. So your school psychologist is going to use IQ tests. You know what? If you are being held on a capital murder charge or a serious crime, and the court thinks that your intellectual functioning may have played a role in your crime, a forensic psychologist may give you an IQ test to determine how individually responsible or culpable or capable you are of this particular crime. I don't know if you know this, but it is against the law. It is considered unconstitutional to put someone who is defined as mentally deficient to death. So the death penalty is not allowable for people who have really, really low IQ scores. So it's used in courts. Now, if you've ever been to a psychologist to be diagnosed for some sort of psychological problem, especially if it's a serious one, your clinical psychologist may be using an IQ test. And what they'll do is they'll give you an IQ test, and they'll give you personality tests, and they'll give you personality IQ tests. And these IQ tests will be used as part of the diagnosis process. Okay? And so you're going to find them in schools, in courts, and even in clinical settings. And you know what? They are even used in business settings. So some of you may have been asked to take an IQ test before you were hired at your company. I don't know if you knew this, but there was a court case about 20 years ago. A gentleman applied to be a police officer for the Connecticut State Police, and he scored too high on the IQ test, and the police decided not to hire him because they thought that he was so intelligent that he would find the job boring and quit. And you know what? The court actually he sued, and the court upheld the Connecticut State Police's decision not to hire him because he was too intelligent. I don't know about any of you, but I find it absolutely ironic and hilarious that he was too smart to be a police officer. What does that say about the police, right? Now, if you've ever joined the military, you took a business IQ test, the ASVAB, which is an IQ test for military recruit. And there's a short IQ test called the Wonderlic. And every year, about the time they have the NFL football draft, you're going to hear people in the NFL talking about the Wonderlic test. I don't know if you know this, but the Wonderlic IQ test is given to all pro football prospects to see how clever they are. So the NFL uses IQ tests. So you're going to find IQ tests. They went from non-existent in 1906 to now you're going to find them in schools, you're going to find them in courts, you're going to find them in your psychologist's office, and you're even going to find them in business settings, right? Now, the most popular ones in use today are called the Wechsler scales, developed by a fellow named David Wechsler. And these are IQ tests that are preferred typically in clinical settings because they're designed as individual one-on-one tests, and they're used in courts and schools for diagnosing learning disorders. Now, there are actually 3 different kinds of Wechsler tests. There's a Wechsler test for children under the age of 6 years old. Did you know that your IQ can be measured starting at the age of 4 years? So a 4-year-old can have their IQ measured. The Wechsler test that does that is called the WIPSI, the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence. Now, if you are in school and your school psychologist gives you an IQ test, you're going to probably take what's called the WISC, which is designed for children from 6 to 16 years of age. And that's the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC. All right. Now, if you go in as an adult, if I was to go in and my clinical psychologist thought it might be useful to measure my IQ, they would give me the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And so the Wechsler scales are the most popular, and they are designed for people of 3 different ages. Stanford-Binet is the first IQ test, still in existence today, but it's not as popular as the Wechsler test. And then there's also this thing called the ASVAB test, which is used for military recruits. And then there's this thing called the Wonderlic, which is used in business settings. How many of you have ever taken an SAT? Anybody ever taken an SAT? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you've taken an SAT test. You know what? An SAT test, it's changed, but it used to be called the Scholastic Aptitude Test. You know what it was? It was simply an IQ test for college students. That's all it was. It was an IQ test telling the college how clever a student you were and how likely you were to graduate in 5 years. I don't know if you know this, but your SAT is a very good predictor of whether or not you will graduate from college in 5 years. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Old school IQ tests used to measure your chronological age and your mental age and compare it to your chronological age. The only problem with that approach is it doesn't make sense for adults, right? It only makes sense for children. I mean, think about it this way. Oops, let me go whiteboard. Where's my whiteboard? Oh yeah, I'm in the way of my whiteboard. Okay. So if you think about it, what if I told you that my age was 52? And if I said that and let's say my age was 52, and I told you that I had the intellect of a 104-year-old. That would be 2 times 100, 200. Would I be super duper smart? 200 is way above 100. So would you say that I'm super smart if my mind is functioning like a 104? No, that wouldn't make sense. What if I was 52 and my mind was as good as let's say a 26-year-old? My ratio is 0.5, right? Does that mean that I am half as smart as an average 52-year-old? No. The problem with using the ratio approach, like I told you, is that it doesn't make sense. So now, instead, what we do is IQ tests use the deviation method. So what you do in the deviation method is you give this test to people and you compare them to people of the same age. So let's say that Ronique, let's say Amber, let's say your child is 12 and she takes an IQ test. What they're going to do is they're going to give her a test with a bunch of questions, and they're going to compare her score to all of the other 12-year-olds who have taken the IQ test. Now, the weird thing with the IQ test, IQ, like a lot of other human measurements, is normally distributed. Do you folks see the curve beneath me? How many of you have seen this curve before? This is called a normal distribution, or you may have even heard of it as a bell curve because it's shaped like a bell, right? Now, the weird thing is with an IQ test or with shoe size or with height or with weight, what you're going to find is that most of the people are grouped up in the middle. Okay, so the height of the curve tells you how many people score that score. So you'll see the most common score is 100. You see how that's the highest part of the bell curve? And I want you to see that the least frequent scores are above 130 or below 70. And so what they do now is they give you a test and they see how you deviate from the age, from the scores of people who are similar to you. Now what they do is they have you take the test, and let's say the test is 240 questions long. I'm going to give it to a whole bunch of 12-year-old children, let's say. All right, I'm going to give this test to a whole bunch of 12-year-old children, and I'm going to find out what the average score is, the average score. And maybe in a test with 240 questions, the average score is 150 questions right. Who knows what it is, but let's say it's 150 questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that raw score of 150 questions and I'm going to assign that the standardized score of 100. Okay? And anybody who scores more than 150 questions, I'm going to give them an IQ score that is greater than 100. Anybody who scores less than the average is going to get an IQ score of less than 100. Now, since IQ scores are normally distributed, they follow this very interesting statistical pattern. What you're going to find is that about 2/3 of the people, 68% of the people's scores, are going to fall somewhere in the very middle of this distribution. Okay? And so the average variation, this average distribution is, and I'm not going to get into the statistics of it, but what you're going to find is that 2/3 of the people will fall within one standard deviation above and below the average. And we're going to call these people average in IQ. 68% of us are going to score somewhere between 85 and 115 on a modern IQ test. We're called average. Now, 13% of us are going to score, or 27% of us are going to score either above that, one to two standard deviations above, or 1 to 2 standard deviations below average. And these people are going to be given a designation as being above average and below average in IQ score. Okay, so if you'll look straight down below me, you'll see that 13.6% of the population scores somewhere between 115 and 130 on an IQ test. These people are called above average. If you look down between 85 and 70, you'll see that another 13.6% score from 70 to 85. These people are called below average. Now, if your child is in the gifted education program, that means that they scored in the top 2.3% of the population on the IQ test. That means your child is gifted. Actually, I think I'm being true. It's actually, I think the top 5% is what they take for standardized education. Okay, so it's a little bit below 130 and above 130. And those people are called gifted. Now, if you'll see down here at the bottom of the distribution, below 70 can earn you a designation called intellectual disability. Now, here's the trick, and this is on the homework and the exam, so listen carefully. Just because you score poorly on an IQ test does not mean that you are given the term mentally retarded, or what we now call intellectually deficient. Okay? All right, some people can't do well on IQ tests because they have terrible dyslexia, or they have terrible attention problems, or they have other sort of academic problems that keep them from doing well on a test. But these people can still do everything they're supposed to do. They hold a job, they pay their bills, they have family relationships. These people are not given the designation of intellectually deficient. In order for you to get the diagnosis of mentally retarded or intellectually deficient, you have to score below 70, and you also have to show impaired ability to perform daily activities. You have to have difficulty taking care of yourself, managing your personal affairs, and other things, all right? And so here's what I want you to get from this particular slide. We can't use the ratio method. I can't try to tell you whether or not you're behind grade level or ahead of grade level like the first tests do, because that doesn't make sense for adults. So instead, what we do is we see how you deviate from people who are your peers, who are your same age peers. And so we give you a bunch of questions. We find out what average is, and if you score higher than the average score, we give you a standardized number, which is above 100. If you score below the average, we're going to give you a standardized number below 100. All right? And so what this does is this allows us to compare people of the same age to find out how clever you are academically compared to your peers. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes this doesn't go as well as I want, and I can't see you, so I don't know how it's going. Hopefully, does that make sense? I'm going to carry on. Now, here's the deal. There was a question a long time ago. Well, here's the deal. IQ tests were not measured with the idea of what they represented. Alfred Binet was simply asked to identify children who might need extra help. So the first IQ tests really were kind of random in the questions that they picked because they were an attempt to compare children with no idea as to what the underlying characteristics of that ability were. Okay? And so the first IQ test treated IQ as sort of as this one unified ability. Let's call that G, if you will, your general intelligence. Okay? However, early critics thought that, you know what, we can't just give people one number, all right, because IQ or your academic ability is made up of sub-abilities, if you will. How many of you in class have ever had the experience of being good at math but being bad at English class? Anybody ever had that experience? How many of you are really good at math but bad at English? Or conversely, how many of you are really good at English and history but really bad at math? Anybody ever had that experience? If you think about it, there you go, MW. Okay, right, John. So you can't just think of IQ or academic ability as one thing called general, okay? Instead, we need to break it up into subparts. So if you go to a clinical psychologist and take an IQ test, or if you're given an IQ test in school, and for those of you who have children, go back and look at your kids' IQ paperwork from third grade, and you'll see this. You not only will you get a general number, a full scale IQ, which is your one number, but you're also going to get two other numbers. One, which represents how well your child did in tasks that required language. This represents their verbal IQ. Now, the IQ test is also going to use some tests that don't necessarily require language. They're going to be your child's ability to use logic, your child's ability to see patterns, and the other kinds of things. This is typically known as your performance IQ or your nonverbal IQ. So if you look at your kid's IQ report, you're going to see that they're given an overall score, which represents G, but then they're going to be given two S's, a verbal IQ score and a nonverbal or performance IQ score. Now, modern IQ tests, and you probably won't get this if your child just takes the standardized IQ tests in school. Your school probably won't generate this paperwork. But if you take one of the Wechsler scales, you're also going to get 22 different scores, okay? And these represent the categories of ability that go into each of these types of IQ. So you're going to have, I think the full test is going to have 11 tasks that feed into your verbal IQ and 10 tasks that feed into your nonverbal IQ. So your verbal IQ is going to see, well, how good is your vocabulary? Are you good at understanding similarities and differences? Can your child read something and understand it? That's a form of verbal ability. I don't know if you knew this, but your simple times tables and your simple arithmetic, that's actually not math ability. That's language ability. Most students are like, what? But if you think about it, you do not do math calculations. If I asked you the question 5 plus 3, your math circuit is not going to calculate that. Your brain has stored that piece of information as verbal information. And all of you know the correct answer is 8. And so your arithmetic, your simple arithmetic, is considered part of your verbal IQ. Do you remember last week I talked about the size of your short-term memory, and I suggested to you that it's 5 or 9 items, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. Well, IQ tests measure your digit span, the size of your short-term memory. And you'll notice that's part of your verbal memory as well. And then on the other hand, there are 10 different tasks that tell us how good you are at nonverbal reasoning. All right? Now, why not just use one number, or why not just use 11 specific numbers? Well, depending upon the situation, you want to use one number or you want to use 11 numbers. Now, if we're trying to decide whether or not this military recruit is good enough for special forces or should be sent to the motor pool, we're going to use one number. If I'm comparing 1,000,000 students to see who gets into Harvard, who gets into NC State, and who gets into Kansas State University, it's better if we use just one number. Okay, and so when you go to when you try to compare children or military recruits, they're probably going to use your one number, your overall IQ score, your overall ASVAB score, your overall SAT score, right? And so we do that when we're comparing lots of people in just a situation where we're trying to classify people for selection. Okay? Now, these specific intellectual abilities are going to be more important in clinical settings when we're trying to diagnose a learning disorder. So, let's say your child has a relatively normal IQ score, but their digit span is really, 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 really low, and their ability to search for symbols is really, really poor. If your child can't remember anything and can't focus on a symbol search task, what psychological disability might your child have? Can anybody tell me what psychological disorder would occur in a normal child that prevents them from remembering things and paying attention? Can anybody tell me what disorder that might represent? And in the meantime, Ashley tells me that she hates English and loves math. Ashley, I am the exact opposite for you. I love English and I tolerate math, right? So I'm maybe above average in math, but I'm super duper gifted in language ability. So what psychological disorder is characterized by people who can't pay attention? Anybody tell me what psychological disorders is characterized by the inability to pay attention? ADD, ADHD, absolutely, April. So if you are diagnosed, if you go into a clinical psychologist or your school psychologist, they can use these specific scores to tell us whether or not you have a math disorder, or whether or not you have dyslexia, or whether or not you have ADHD. So if we're comparing a bunch of normal people and we just want to find out who goes to Harvard and who goes to NC State, we're going to use that one number. If I'm trying to figure out exactly what your psychological problem is or what your difficulty in school is, I'm going to use all of these individual numbers, right? So, so what's the best way to think of IQ? It's not G. It's not just your overall intellectual ability, but it's your ability on a bunch of different tasks that combine together tell us how clever you are. Are you clever verbally? Are you clever non-verbally? Or do you have a specific learning disorder that we can determine from looking at the pattern of individual scores in your IQ test? Okay? So, that's what we think of with IQ tests. Now, here's the thing. IQ tests have been the focus of a ton of interest. As soon as IQ tests were invented, now, IQ tests were not invented with the idea of discovering what intelligence is. IQ tests were not invented as a way of measuring intelligence. They were not. Instead, they were designed to identify children who would need extra help in school. But as soon as IQ tests were invented and they began to be used, people said, hey, wait a minute. Those tests must measure this thing called intelligence. And we're going to talk about why this is not true on Thursday. But suddenly, people became acutely interested in IQ tests. And people thought, wow, this would be a good way to figure out who is valuable in our world and who is not valuable in our world. And I will tell you that in the early 20th century, if you wanted to come into America, if you were an immigrant coming into America, you had to take an IQ test. And we only accepted those people who scored okay on IQ tests because eugenists and other people who thought America was better than the rest of the world didn't want dumb people coming into America. And suddenly the war over the value of IQ tests heated up. And suddenly people asked the question, is IQ something you're born with, or is IQ something you develop? Now, there's a branch of science called behavioral genetics. And behavioral genetics is interested in figuring out what human qualities are genetic and what human qualities are environmental. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So, behavioral genetics are those people who try to answer the question, is this ability created by nature or is it created by nurture? Now, here's how the behavioral genetics paradigm works. What I do is I find a measurement of interest. In this case, it'll be IQ tests. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the same IQ test to people who have differing levels of genetic similarity. So you folks probably know that identical twins are genetically identical. They share 100% of the same genes. All right? Now, siblings, if you have a brother or a sister, you are 25% genetically similar. If you have a cousin, you are less than 10% genetically similar. And if you are comparing yourself to a stranger, you're 0% genetically similar. Now, if you have an adopted brother or sister, you are 0% genetically similar to them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give IQ tests to people who have different levels of genetic similarity, and we're going to see how similar they score on IQ tests. And what you're going to find is that people who are identical twins score extremely similarly on IQ tests. So identical twins, the correlation between their IQ scores are going to be 0.7, which is the highest correlation you will see in science. They are extremely similar in how they score on IQ tests. Now, you can even look at identical twins who are reared apart. So maybe we have an identical set of twins and they were given up for adoption, and then they were moved to different homes and lived in different homes. Even if they're brought up in different homes, what you're going to find is that their IQ is still incredibly similar, even if they are not raised together. Now, what you're going to find is that the IQ of identical twins is much higher than the IQ of siblings. So if you'll see, the identical twins bar is up here almost 0.8. And if you'll see over here, the siblings raised together, the other red bar is hovering right below a 0.5 correlation. So if you look at the identical twins, you can see that their IQs correlate more than siblings. This difference shows us that there is a genetic quality to IQ. Okay? Now, if you look at fraternal twins, which are really the same as siblings, okay, and identical twins, what you're going to notice is that your identical twins, your siblings raised together, have a higher correlation. Your identical twins raised together have a higher correlation than those raised apart. It's not much, but it's a little bit. And that sort of shows us a little bit of the environmental effect, right? Now, notice that siblings adopted siblings that have zero genetic similarity, still show a small correlation. And so we know that environment does affect your IQ score, but not nearly as much as your genes do. And this is going to be very important in America during the early 20th centuries because there is a branch of science called eugenics that decided that since IQ was mostly determined by genes, we should find those people who have low IQ and we should sterilize them so they can't pass on their genes to the next generation. And from the early 1920s up to 1970, people were sterilized. Some people were sterilized because they scored low on IQ tests. Did you know that the last person to be sterilized for low IQ was sterilized here in the state of North Carolina in 1970? 1970, right? And so one of the things we know is that there's this quality called IQ. It's related to your school ability, and we know that it has a strong genetic component. All right, and we can measure this using this thing called an IQ test, starting at the age of 4. Now, what we're going to do on Monday, on Thursday, because today's Tuesday, is we're going to talk a little bit more about what intelligence is. So if you'll notice today, I didn't tell you one specific thing about really what we think intelligence is. Instead, I talked about this thing called an IQ test and how it was composed of all these subtests. And the IQ test spent decades being developed before anybody asked the fundamental critical question: is this really a good measure of what it means to be intelligent? And so on Thursday, I'm going to try to suggest to you that intelligence and IQ are similar, but not the exact thing. And I'm going to suggest to you that IQ tests leave out a very important part of what it means to be, quote, intelligent. Okay, that's all I have to say for today. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Don't forget we have webinar tomorrow night at 7 p.m. and Thursday night at 8 p.m. All right, we're going to be talking about IQ tests and intelligence, and I'm going to be asking you the question: what do you think makes a person intelligent? Is it a test score, or is it something else that humans do? All right, and so that's what we're going to talk about in webinar on Wednesday and Thursday. If nobody has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and sign off the broadcast. If you decide that you want to talk about something later, send me a text on my phone, and I would be more than happy to talk to you about it. Okay? And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye for the morning, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great day, okay? Bye.